Hello, everybody. Today is the 5th of September 2025. And this is my video for today, The Way They Loved. I have chosen two candidates, André Gide and St. John of the Cross. I could have chosen, of course, Oscar Wilde instead of André Gide. I could have, but I didn't because I'm binging at the moment on the writings of André Gide, and because Oscar Wilde and André Gide have much in common. The objects of their loves, their beloved, which they encountered or were awakened to, in the case of Gide, in the northern shores of Africa, in the bazaars and the parks. In the case of Wilde, he discovered that love earlier in England, but in Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia, where both of them would vacation and found their satisfaction. So they have much in common, but they are different. And B, because unlike Wilde, for whom aestheticism was often playful and decadent, a pose, Gide was deadly serious about it. His mystical sensuality wasn't just dandified, it was his way of escaping or negating he was struggling with this, the Protestant background that he had, and searching for life. Oscar Wilde was, I think, a poseur. He knew what he was doing very well. He knew and enjoyed how to shock people, the effete, the artiste, the blue carnation, and so on. He knew what he was doing and enjoyed it. Gide discovered it in those shores, struggled with it until he gave in, both in a different way. So I chose André Gide. Why contrast Gide, late 19th, 20th century? He died in 1950, I believe. Why did I choose Gide? Why am I contrasting him with St. John of the Cross, 1500s? To some, it might appear a little bit of a blasphemy, this, but two different loves, the divine love and the earthly or mundane love. But I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to talk here about their different loves, the object of their love, their beloved, because that is obvious. I want to talk about how they loved, what they understood by love, how they dealt with love. Not their beloved, but the ways to their beloved, the ways they loved. So I'm going to actually share with you, this will be in the middle, at the end of the video, a debate between the two that I made up myself. I've been working all this all day, by the way. Can you believe this? So I would appreciate, if you enjoyed, I would appreciate a like or a share or something, just an acknowledgement, because I've been working on it all day. But a word before I enter into their explanations of how they see love acting on the beloved and what love is, and that debate. First, I think I have to introduce them to you, a word or two about about each of them, a little summary on the mystic and the writer, or the writer and the mystic. And then on how each understood love and how they went about it. Of course, they couldn't be more distant on who they were themselves, the social status, Gide, relative wealth and applause and distinction and so on. And the other one, St. John of the Cross, extreme poverty. They're different, very different also in outlook, but their earliest experiences, who they were and how they were brought up, shaped each of them, as all our early experiences shape us all. So, a little bit about who they were and their lives. First, John, he's older, so a Carmelite. The Carmelites see their foundation in, they go back, they believe, to the prophet Elijah and Mount Carmel, God in Hebrew, Lord. And speaking about the vine of the Lord, and there is still, I believe, a red wine called Carmel in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was in Haifa. There is still a monastery there, the Stella Maris. I hope it's still there if it hasn't been bombed or something. That is where the first Cenobites and the Eremites, the desert, that is where it was founded. So anyway, John of the Cross, to put it bluntly, first, what did you get when you bring together, when you join a Jewish Christian and a Muslim Christian, a Jewish Christian man and a Muslim Christian woman? St. John of the Cross. On his father's side, Gonzalo was his name. He came from, not himself, but earlier in his family life. It was a family of Jewish conversos in the past, before him. They were very wealthy merchants in textiles. They were from a little town in Yepes, called Yepes, in the province of Toledo in Spain, just south of Madrid. And they were very wealthy, and he would travel, as merchants did, and merchants still did up to last century, from where they lived and had their artisans. I don't know whether to call them factories. They were not factories, but where their artisans work. They would travel to the big cities, the wealthy cities, to sell their wares, and then they would come back. And Gonzalo would go from Toledo to a place which was at the time the main metropolis. It was at the time the capital of Spain, Medina del Campo. And he would go there on a routine basis. And he would stop, the last stop before getting from Toledo to Medina was a little tiny place called Fontiveros. It's in the province of Avila, and that is where his mother and father would met, and where he was born, St. John of the Cross. But the thing is that Gonzalo he was about 19 or 20, and for some reason he always managed to stop at the same inn. It's going to give you the, speculation here. It's totally speculative, but perhaps not entirely wrong. You know the Italian sentence, se non è vero è ben trovato. If it is not true, it is at least well conceived, or if it's not true, at least it's a good story. Gonzalo was very rich, 20 years old, and met Catalina, his mother, Catherine, Catalina, who was an orphan girl. She was 17, and she would go and clean there, and perhaps even cook. Perhaps they looked into each other's eyes. Gonzalo fell in love with her. Perhaps it was Perhaps it was more than just the fact that it was perhaps the most comfortable inn uh, before getting to the main city, to the Big Apple. Perhaps they had better food there. Perhaps they had better beds without too many bugs in the mattresses, or what passed for mattresses in those days. Or it could also be that there was a beautiful girl there doing the cleaning and the cooking. And her name was Catalina, and she was 17. She came not from far away, from a parish called La Moragna. Now, that place was where it was associated with Muslims from Muslim origin anyway. So if you came from La Moragna, it meant that you had been Muslim at that was your tradition, your origin. Anyway, they met and they married, but a problem immediately that Gonzalo was totally, absolutely disinherited by his family for marrying her. He was, I said, from a very wealthy family. She was an orphan and had nobody and didn't have to ask anyone's permission to marry. She was a weaver by trade, falling on hard times. The moment you hear weaver, you know Morisca from a Moorish background. Gonzalo so suffered by his family's rejection of his wife that he actually became very ill, and he died very soon afterwards. He died in his 20s. By the time he died, however, Catalina had given him 3 sons. The first was Francisco, Paco is the diminutive, the nickname for Francisco, Paco, and then Juan, John, and then Luis. When their father died, Paco was 4 or 5, John was 1 year old, and Luis was still in her womb. He was unborn. And she was left with absolutely nothing. Long story, but Louise was born but died of hunger. St. John will make reference to it in some of his works when he speaks of hunger and dying of hunger, and he says, and when I say dying of hunger, I know what I'm talking about. Paco, his elder brother, was a really good boy and very responsible. He worked at the age of 9. He started working in construction, bricklayer, I suppose. Catalina, when Luis died, decided to move to the big city, to Medina del Campo. Surely there are more opportunities there for work and so on. In any case, when you are so poor, in wealthy cities, you always find a lot of leftovers everywhere, all over the place. John, at the age of 5 or 6, found work at a hospital. It was a local hospital, many of the patients dying from syphilis there. You remember that it was it hadn't been long since the discovery of America, The Europeans brought illnesses to the natives in America, but they also caught illnesses themselves and brought them to Europe. And one of them was syphilis, and it was just all over the place. He found a job there at the age of 4 or 5, and his job was to empty the bedpans of the sick, full not only of urine, but sometimes blood, sometimes just pus, because the infections, to cure infections, sometimes they would, if one of, part of your body was infected, they would just cut it through and then squeeze the pus out of them. And there was a pan there that you had to put there so that the pus will drop into the bedpan, the chamber pot. Don't know what name to give it. So his job was to hold the pan while this was being done, and then to empty them. And this was in exchange for food. They would feed him. Amazingly, as an aside, when he dies, his death is caused by a terrible infection that he got. He had a very bad cut and got infected, and they took him to the city to cure the infection, and they cured it so well that he got infected all over. From the infection spread, and one of his brothers in the Carmelite order would be there holding the pan, squeezing, because he was cut also, and squeezing the pus from his wounds. Imagine his thoughts going back to his childhood, when he was doing that himself. The infection had been first on the leg and then spread to his arms, and yet in that circumstance he wrote one of the most beautiful sonnets of love. Upon a quest of love, I'm paraphrasing, I flew so high, I caught the prey at last. So he died of that. He died of septicemia, this blood poisoning, really. I looked it up to give you a description. It refers to a serious condition where microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, or fungi enter the bloodstream, causing a potentially life-threatening systemic illness. Basically, the invasion of these organisms spread of pathogenic agents and their toxins through the bloodstream. But anyway, I digress. Going back to when he was a child, small child, working at the hospital, emptying bedpans, he was seen by a young 18 or so year old Jesuit novice. His name was John Boniface, who's going to play a very important part in his life as one of his teachers. He found a young boy actually working on a piece of wood, making a cross with a little knife that he had and actually working the wood. And he was so focused and so intense into what he was doing that Boniface actually came to talk to him, knowing that he was the little boy who was emptying the bedpans. And he asked him, why he was working there, who his parents are, and where he lives. I have no father. He died. And his mother, Catalina, yes, she's a weaver, so immediately she was from Muslim descent. So a very poor boy, and yet Boniface found something in this young boy by the way he was answering his questions, how serious he was. He was so little. He found that he was intelligent. He could respond politely, yes, but intelligently too. He realized that this boy had a lot of potential. He had a good mind, but of course, no possible means. At that time, you see, the Jesuits had instituted what they called the Ratio Studiorum, which was an alternative to the regular universities, and that was to train to provide their own universities for future leaders. Not as the other universities in secular laicism, but to actually make them good Christian leaders. And they were very successful at that, the Jesuits, for a long, long time. Therefore, they were obviously attacked, exiled from just about everywhere, all over the place, and for many centuries. And then at the end, they sort of came back at the beginning of the 20th century, but although wearing the same, this is my personal opinion, although wearing the same clothes and the same name and same everything, they had changed. I feel that they have been infiltrated very clearly. This is not to suggest that there might not be some very good Jesuits there, but their teaching has totally changed. In any case, I digress again. But so this was for future leaders, but at the same time, in the evening, they would have lessons for people like John, who had no means, the very poor, but who could study. And that is what he attended, and attended those lessons. And he was very good. He was a good student. Anyway, eventually he will make it to the University of Salamanca. He didn't enjoy it very much because this was the typical rich students there, many of them. And his personality was already kind of formed, perhaps, and he dreamed of being a monk and a Carthusian, for the contemplative life. Anyway, long story, but he left it, and then he met Saint Teresa of Avila. She asked him to continue his studies, but in any case, he became joined her in the reform, and it wasn't easy. He he ended up in prison. He was imprisoned by his own brothers, Carmelites, who didn't agree with the reform. And there he was for 6 months. No, 9 months. 9 months in a cubicle. You couldn't even call it cell. A cubicle. It was like a toilet in those days. He couldn't even lay sort of straight on the ground. It was so tiny. I have to say that he suffered from rickets all his life. Again, lack of food. He was very short. He wasn't even 1 meter 50. He didn't even get to 5 foot. I don't believe. So Saint Teresa of Avila used to call him my little Seneca, my little philosopher. And sometimes when she had 4 Carmelites, she said, including John of the Cross, she said, I have 3.5. The half being John. In any case, so he managed to escape. Some people helped him. When he died, his body will be put in a bag in a hole on the ground, found many, many years later, transferred to where he is now. He is buried in a church in the province of Segovia, not far from Madrid. And his body is uncorrupted. Okay, every so many years, I don't know what it is it 50 or 100 or something like that, they open the body, and the last time that it was done, it's not long ago, and it was still there, uncorrupted. And he's buried in the church and in the altar. It's like a relic, yeah. And the altar is on top. The mass is celebrated there. Anyway, he is the patron saint of poets, a virtuoso of the language for sure. I won't say that this is an introduction of who he was. What I want to emphasize is the extreme poverty that he suffered. And also, a question comes to my mind. In that extreme poverty, you see, you're shaped by it, right? You have to be. And the question is here, the question I ask myself is, how come that he took the path of such altruism and love of mankind? Because it's very easy when you are at the bottom of the ladder to, I suppose for many people, and it's perfectly natural to grow up resentful or angry or even hateful, or, comparing yourself to others. Why me? That kind of thing. Okay, so that happens. What is it that makes a person in those same circumstances actually be able to sacrificial love of such magnitude? What is it? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's the moral. I think it has something to do with the moral formation, the vision of humanity and of the world and of God and everything else that you get from very early on. Anyway, that is all I wanted to say. Now let's go on to our other candidate for the debate that I have made up between the two of them. André Gide. André Gide, French, was born November the 22nd, 1869 in Paris, and died in February 19th, 1951 in Paris. So I got this from the internet. I believe it was Britannica, so I'll just read it to you. French writer who received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947. Just a few things. Gide was the only child of Paul Gide and Juliette Rondeau. His father was of a Southern Huguenot, originally of peasant stock, Protestant, I would say, I think, I'm not too sure, but the Huguenots were more the Protestant, the Puritan side of Protestantism. His mother, a Norman heiress, although Protestant by upbringing, had belonged to a northern Catholic family long established at Rouen, France. When Gide was 8, he was sent to the École Alsacienne in Paris, but his education was much interrupted by bouts of ill health. After his father's early death in 1880, his well-being became the chief concern of his very devout, very austere mother, often kept at home. He was taught by indifferent tutors and by his mother's governess, I have been reading his autobiography and two or three of his three books of his. While in the autobiography, I showed it to you in the previous video. If it dies, while in Rouen, Gide formed a very deep attachment for his cousin, Madeleine Rondeau. He returned to the École Alsacienne to prepare for his baccalaureate examination, and after passing it in 1889, he decided to spend his life in writing and music and travel. In 1891, a school friend, the writer Pierre Louis, introduced Gide into the poet Mallarmé's famous Tuesday evenings, which were the center at the time of the French symbolist movement. And for a time, Gide was influenced by the symbolists' aesthetic theories. In 1893, Gide paid his first visit to North Africa, hoping to find release there from his dissatisfaction with the restrictions imposed by his puritanically strict Protestant upbringing. Gide's contact with the Arab world and its radically different moral standards, says the Britannica, I think, helped to liberate him from the, let's say, Victorian social and sexual conventions that he felt very stifled by. One result of this intellectual revolt against what he considered social hypocrisy was his growing awareness of his homosexuality. The lyrical prose poem Les Nourritures Terrestres from 1897, translated as The Fruits of the Earth, reflects Gide's personal liberation from the fear of sin and his acceptance of the need to follow his own impulses. So he is rebelling now. He begins to react against what he considered this, he called rigorist Protestant morality. After he returned to France, Gide found relief at shedding all these constraints. He calls them the shackles of convention. And they evaporated really in that what he said was the stifling atmosphere of the Paris salons. He satirized his surroundings in a book entitled Marshlands in 1894, which is a brilliant parable of animals who, living always in dark caves, lose their sight because they never use it. In 1894, Gide returned to North Africa, where he met Irish writer Oscar Wilde and his companion, the English poet and Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, and who encouraged him to embrace his homosexuality. He was recalled to France because of his mother's illness, however, and she died in May 1895. In October of 1895, that same year, Gide married his cousin Madeleine, who had earlier refused him. Early in 1896, he was elected mayor of the commune of La Roque. At 27, he was the youngest mayor in France. He took his duties seriously, but managed to complete Fruits of the Earth then, which was published in 1897, and when published, fell completely flat. although after World War I it was to become Gide's most popular and influential work. In the post-war generation, it's called to each individual to express fully whatever is in him, evoked an immediate response. Excuse me. During most of this period, Gide was suffering deep anxiety and distress. Although his love for Madeleine had given his life what he called its mystic orientation, he found himself unable, in a close, permanent relationship, to reconcile this love with his need for freedom. He kept talking about the freedom and the constraints of love, and for experiences of every kind. In the early 1900s, Gide had already begun to be widely known as a literary critic, and in 1908 he was foremost among those who founded La Nouvelle Revue Française, the literary review that was to unite progressive French writers until the Second World War. During the First World War, Gide worked in Paris, first for the Red Cross, then in a soldiers' convalescent home, and finally in providing shelter to war refugees. In 1916, he returned to Couverville, his home since his marriage, and began to write again. In 1918, his friendship for the young French director Marc Allegret caused a serious crisis in his marriage when his wife, in jealous despair, destroyed her. He called them the dearest. He called it the dearest possession on earth. That was his letters to her. After the war, a great change took place in Gide, and his face began to assume that, some would say, serene expression of his later years by the decision involved in beginning his autobiography and the completion in 1918 of a book, Corridon, which is a Socratic dialogue in defense of homosexuality, which he had begun earlier. And he found that he had at last achieved some inner reconciliation. Corridon's publication in 1924 was disastrous, though, and Gide was violently attacked even by his closest friends. Gide called his next work Les Faux Monnayeurs in 1926, The Counterfeiters, his only novel. It is the most complex and intricately constructed of his works, dealing as it does with the relatives and teachers of a group of schoolboys subject to corrupting influences both in and out of the classroom. The Counterfeiters treats all of Gide's favorite themes in a progression of scenes and happenings. In 1925, Gide set off for French Equatorial Africa. In 1938, his wife dies. After a long estrangement, they had been brought together by her final illness. With the outbreak of World War II, Gide began to realize the value of, beginning to be a change here, it's beginning to appreciate the value of tradition and to appreciate the past. In a series of imaginary interviews, written in 1941 and 42 for Le Figaro. He expressed a new concept of liberty, declaring that absolute freedom destroys both the individual and society. His main thing all his life was the individual, the individual. Now, he begins to see that perhaps too much emphasis on the individual alone has repercussions for society as a whole. He says freedom must be linked with the discipline of tradition. From 1942 until the end of the war, Gide lived in North Africa. There he wrote Theseus, a retelling of a Greek myth whose story symbolizes Gide's realization of the value of the past. Theseus returns to Ariadne only because he has clung to the thread of tradition. In June 1947, Gide received the first honor of his life, and that was the Doctor of Letters, the University of Oxford. It was followed in November by the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 1950, he published the last volume of his journals. I'm working through them at the moment. Which took the record of his life up to his 80th birthday. All Gide's writings illuminate some aspect of his complex character. He is seen at his most characteristic, however, in the journal that he kept from 1889, a unique work of more than 1,000,000 words in which he records his experiences, impressions, interests, and moral crises during a period of more than 60 years. After its publication, he resolved to write no more. Gide's lifelong emphasis on the self-aware and sincere individual as the touchstone of both collective and individual morality was complemented by the tolerant views he expressed on literary, social, and political questions throughout his career. For most of his life, a controversial figure he was, Gide was long regarded as a revolutionary for his open support of the claims of the individual's freedom of action in defiance of conventional morality. Before his death, he was widely recognized as an important humanist in the great 17th century French tradition. He has ensured his place among the masters of French literature. La Porte étroite, 1909, translated as The Straight is the Gate, which I showed you in the last video, is one of Gide's most subtle and painful novels. Already sensing that tension that we are going to find throughout his work. It's a story about love thwarted, deformed, and spiritualized to the point of distraction. Jerome and Elisa are the protagonists. Jerome is in love with Elisa. Elisa loves him back, but it's a sort of a push and pull and push and pull. Yes, I love you, but then she goes back and retracts, and he's never sure whether she loves him or not. And you feel this tension. Why, having that she's in love with him. Why does she keep saying no? I should say that is not because she's a flirt. It's not because she is leading him on and playing with him. She's not flirtish. She's not a coquette. You can see that she's a very, very serious girl, very responsible, very moral, but she feels that is this the narrow gate. She feels that she has it is the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, not to feel joy out of love, not to give yourself, not to give your love, but to retain it, to restrict it. And why is she doing this? Because you can see from the very beginning that she's not leading him on in a silly way. Very serious. She's very moral. She keeps referring to what God wishes and what God wants and so on. So here are the main layers of what Gide is saying about love in this book. First of all is the biblical title, Straight is the Gate, which comes from St. Matthew, because straight is the gate and narrow is the way. Sorry, let me say that again. Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. From the beginning, Gide frames the novel as a meditation on the way of salvation, but through renunciation itself, not fulfillment. We're going to see how, in my view, I'm Catholic. What can I do about it? So I think she, the protagonist, Elisa, he is showing us how she might misunderstand the meaning of renunciation, because it certainly doesn't reach fulfillment. Alisa, the heroine, interprets love through this lens of self denial, turning human affection into a test of purity. So the more she restrains from giving love, the more pure she is, she finds. There is nothing of the over exuberance or the joy of love, of giving yourself in love. No, it's very restrained. And this is what the author is going to react against. That's number one. Now, the love between Jerome and Elisa. At first, Jerome and Elisa's love is tender, innocent, and mutual. But Elisa's growing, one could even say, obsession with self sacrifice, which she misunderstands, renouncing joy to remain spiritually worthy, turns their relationship into an exercise in deprivation. What begins as romantic love slowly gets transfigured into a kind of ascetic self cruelty, almost a religious martyrdom. A third point, sacrificial love versus twisted love. Gide is showing how something noble, the desire to remain pure, to remain spiritual, to remain faithful to God, which is what Alisa wants, can actually become grotesque even when it denies the basic human longing for happiness. This is what he wants to show. Alisa's sacrifice becomes a form, he feels, of idolatry of sacrifice itself. She sacrifices not for Jerome's good, not for God's command, but for the sheer principle of renunciation itself. So her love becomes twisted. Instead of uniting, it separates. Instead of affirming life, it negates it. Gide's critique, he wrestled with issues of religion, of morality, and desire throughout his life. And he does not celebrate Elisa's choice for sure. Rather, he's exposing the tragedy of a love poisoned by excessive scruples, by a morality that actually confuses, you can see, holiness with self annihilation. In short, love should lead to life and growth, not paralysis and death. When what she sees as sacrificial love denies human flourishing, it becomes destructive. And I agree with that. But then I agree with all that, but then he takes it in a direction that is going to kill it rather than fulfill it. We're going to see how. That horrid beauty, he says, the noble is beautiful and tragic because Alisa's love is sincere. She truly believes she's doing right. As I said, she's not playing or leading him on. She truly believes that she's doing the right thing, what God wants. Yet the reader and Jerome feel the horror of wasted happiness. She dies at the end alone, and a wasted happiness of a love mutilated by, he feels, and I feel too, spiritual rigorism, he calls it. So Guide in this book, Guide, Gide in this book is asking, is this really holiness? Or is it a perverse misunderstanding of love and of religion? Which is a good question. Gide is showing how love, when filtered through an obsession with purity and sacrifice, this is why I bring John of the Cross here, okay? He says, when love, when filtered through an obsession with purity and sacrifice, can become distorted into something tragic, even cruel, really. It is not true, he feels, not true sacrificial love, which gives life, but it's a kind of moralistic, anxious self-denial that kills both lovers' chance at joy. Alisa's sacrifice is indeed a deformation. It's not mystical love in the sense of how Saint John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila saw it, where renunciation is in service of a greater union, a union with God that deepens joy even amid suffering. For John of the Cross and the other mystics, deprivation is transfigured into, well, certainly for John of the Cross, that deprivation is transfigured into a paradoxical fullness. The soul is emptied of attachments in order to be filled with love, in order to be filled with divine love, with the love of the beloved for the beloved, and this overflows into greater vitality. By contrast, Alice's Protestant rigorism, as Gide himself, and he was one of them, but he grew up as a Puritan, in a Puritan household, so he knew this mindset intimately. He emphasizes a moral scruple, that puritanical view of it, emphasizes moral scruple, self-examination, and purity of intention, but to such an extent that it strangles both eros and even agape. We know what eros is. Agape is that selfless, the Greek word selfless, unconditional love that traditionally denotes selfless love. In the New Testament, the fatherly love of God for humanity, as well as the human reciprocal love for God. We'll come back to this reciprocal love in a moment at the end, when I'll try to explain it further. The difference between singular love and reciprocal love. In Scripture, the transcendent agape love is the highest form of love and is contrasted with eros or erotic love and also philia or brotherly love. So, what is agape understood by, for example, a Catholic? Agape is total, committed, sustained, and self giving love. It's a love that is committed to the good of the whole person and not what you get out of the person. It's a love that is willing to make sacrifices, but for the good of the beloved. Jesus models agape love for us, dying on the cross. So, comparisons before we begin the debate. Mystical love for John of the Cross, renunciation leading to union, which is life-giving and radiant. Alisa's love is renunciation, which leads to isolation and therefore paralysis and sterility, deathly. It's as though Alisa confuses the gate with the goal. She lingers at the narrow gate of sacrifice and never passes through into that spaciousness of divine love. That's why one senses something a little bit horrid in it. And Gide is dramatizing what happens when love of God or sacrifice become abstracted from genuine communion or genuine union for John. Gide sees Alisa's love as something that becomes a kind of idolatry of renunciation, which negates rather than fulfills. Here are some few contrasts between Alisa's Puritan Protestantism, that scruple love, and the mystical love of St. John of the Cross, a comparison of their, if you like, spiritual psychology. So, two kinds of sacrificial love. Alisa's love, this is in Straight is the Gate, versus mystical love of St. John of the Cross. First of all, the dimension of it. So we have Alisa's Protestant sacrifice and John's mystical love. The source of the sacrifice, the source of it for Alisa is scruples of conscience, fear of impurity, a certain obsession with worthiness. For John, in his mystical love, the source of a sacrifice is the burning desire for God, the beloved, love overflowing beyond the self. How about the direction of that love? For Alisa is away from human intimacy. She renounces Jerome to preserve her purity. In John, that direction of love is going to be mystical towards God, the beloved, but in a way that deepens intimacy with others. Mystics become warmer, more compassionate. The goal of that love for Alisa is a negative goal, is to avoid fault, to avoid stain, to avoid self-indulgence. For John of the Cross, is the goal is a positive one. Union with the divine bridegroom, which transforms suffering into joy, which transforms suffering into joy. What is the tone of that love? For Alisa is anxious, it is rigid, is joyless, it's self-annihilating. For John of the Cross, that mystical love is ecstatic, inflamed, paradoxically liberating. What is the fruit of that love? For Alisa is, at the end, sterility, wasted love, broken human connection, deathliness. For John, the fruit of that love is fertility, creative energy, the writings, the reform, the new communities of love and prayer. What is the experience of that love? For Alisa, and it is clear that Gide sees this, is sacrifice almost for sacrifice sake. The idol of renunciation, he calls it. For John, sacrifice is purgation, a purification. The emptying makes room. The more you empty of yourself, the more room you make for the fullness of the beloved. What is that gate? For Alisa, narrow, and unfortunately she stays there. She never passed through. She remains at the threshold. For John is narrow, but opening onto infinite spaciousness. My goodness, so many writings. Teresa's The Interior Castle, all that. So, in short, Alisa confuses renunciation, the actual renunciation, with holiness. John sees renunciation as a passage, not an end. That's why his love is life-giving, while hers is deadly. Gide is showing here the tragic effects of a truncated spirituality, one that never blossoms into fullness. Between Protestant Puritan severity and a more expansive, even mystical sense of love, Gide never experienced mystical love in the sense of John of the Cross, a God-centered, life-giving union. His mysticism, the way he understands it, is bound up with aestheticism or sensuality and revolt against bourgeois, he calls it bourgeois Protestant morality. That is what he's fighting. But somehow he stays there. How is he going to react then against this, what he considered this bourgeois morality? A few distinctions here. He's concerned and he's against this. This is what he calls it, Protestant rigorism, the Protestant rigorism of his upbringing. He grew up, as I said, in a strict Huguenot household. Duty, purity, renunciation, straight is the gate, is a direct dramatization of that environment. Number one. Number two, the aesthetic, the dandy turn, inspired by Wilde. He's he's uncomfortable with it, but nevertheless, his friendship with Oscar Wilde, well, they weren't really friends. I mean, they met briefly, as he tells in his autobiography, but it did have an effect. They met in the 1890s, but that meeting shook him loose from what he considered his repression. Wilde introduced him to the idea that beauty, art, and desire themselves can be sacred also. Kind of a mystical experience, but in the aesthetic. Number three, North Africa and his liberation. He called it so. I'm doing this, I'm tired of it. But his liberation, he called it that. He travels in Algeria and Morocco between 1893 and 1895, and often later, as we saw. And that led him to embrace his homosexuality and to view sensual pleasure as a kind of spiritual epiphany. So, even though he is going against that rigorism, that Protestant rigorism that he calls, for him, the desert, the sun, the bodies of young men all become symbols of a transcendent vitality. Yes, Gide's sense of mystical, therefore, became eroticized and aestheticized. He was always rebelling against the Protestant narrow gate. But instead of stepping into the fullness of divine love, like John did, he veered into what you might call an artistic pagan mysticism. And he said himself that his god was a pagan god. An artistic pagan mysticism where Eros itself is the sacred fire. Can we call it depraved? Well, from a traditional Christian standpoint, yes, it is a distortion. From Gide's standpoint, however, he saw it as a liberation from hypocrisy, an attempt to reclaim a natural mysticism, the natural mysticism of the body and the natural mysticism of desire. That is why his works oscillate between tragic asceticism, as in the straight is the gate. I'm sorry, I have to just stop for just a second because my voice is giving way. Let me see if I'm better now. So between this tragic asceticism, like in the book Straight is the Gate, and then in other works, an exuberant liberation, many books. If it died, they more or less his journals, others that I will mention in a minute. There are two sides. These are two sides of his own divided soul. Gide himself describes this split himself in his journals, where he wrestles explicitly between what he calls the God of the Protestants and what the God that he now worships himself, the God of sun and desire. Gide's journals are really the key to seeing this split. He is unusually candid there, and you can watch him move between the two poles all his life. Another point is the Protestant God of duty. In his journal, in his early journal entries between 89 and 93, Gide agonizes over purity and chastity, the narrow gate, and living a life of moral perfection. He fears desire, especially sexual desire, as something that stains the soul. Martin Luther had the same problem there. Typical entry, he speaks of renouncing myself for God or fleeing the flesh, language very close to Alisa's in Straight is the Gate. Now, point number 5, the breakthrough in North Africa. On his trips to Algeria and Morocco, starting in 1893, Gide experiences the opposite revelation. The sun, the desert, youth, sensual freedom. In his journal, he writes about feeling reborn, not into sin, but into truth. This is the truth, that the body and desire are natural, even divine. He contrasts that gloomy God of his Huguenot upbringing with a pagan God of joy. He even describes the Mediterranean sun as my true religion now. Let's see where he's gone. Point number 6, the two gods. In one of his most revealing passages, he writes, and paraphrasing, there are two gods in me, the God of my childhood, the God of the Protestants, severe, joyless, exacting. And the other, he says, the God of the sun, of Dionysus, of liberation and beauty. And he says himself, I oscillate between them. So this is not obviously mysticism in the Christian sense, but rather a divided spiritual psychology. One pole ascetic, one pole erotic. Now, toward the mystical aestheticism, later in life, Gide tends to resolve this split by siding with the God of sun and desire. Finally, for him, he's decided. But he still frames this as a kind of spirituality. Spirituality, he speaks of grace in sensual experience, of being touched by a higher force in moments of beauty and erotic encounter. He essentially relocates the mystical. He takes it from the cloister to the body, from God to Eros. So you could say that Gide's journal dramatizes that tension that we see, the deformed, sterile sacrifice of that misunderstood duty from straight is the gate versus the exuberant, eroticized mysticism of liberation for him. In his book Corridon, both were real for him, both haunted him, and he never found a final reconciliation, which is why his novels often feel split, unresolved, even disturbing. What gets to the heart of Gide's psychology and also of not only Gide's, perhaps the broader modernist view of today? Well, here's one way of looking at it. One, the trap of the reaction to what you were brought up with. If you want to rebel against it, that trap of reaction. When someone grows up in an atmosphere of extreme repression, as I said, he called it Protestant rigorism, Huguenot rigorism in Gide's case. The temptation is not to find a middle path, but to flee to the opposite extreme. They feel that the self has been starved. This happens to everybody. Yes, you've been in one extreme. The cage suddenly opens. You feel that you have been starved, denied, in his case, humiliated by duty. And so when it breaks free, it doesn't first look for moderation. It hungers for excess. You go way over to the other side for the taste of what was forbidden. So the rigidity and the rigidity on the one side and then the depravity at the other extreme are sort of like mirror images. One defines itself against the other. That's number one. Number two, all or nothing temperament that he had. Gide was not a moderate man. His temperament was absolutist. He wanted purity or he wanted ecstasy. He saw the Protestant God, it was all about renunciation, whereas the Dionysian God, all about affirmation. But he was never really able to reconcile them. He oscillated, but each time he swung, it was all the way from one extreme to the other. Number three is the aesthetic and romantic inheritance of the time, because part of this comes from the age. In the 19th century, there were many thinkers. Wilde was not the only one. In other ways, Nietzsche, in other ways, Baudelaire, who had framed freedom not as balance, but as transgression. In other words, you were free if you broke away from all that, whatever came before you, and then you did your own thing, as shockingly in many cases as possible. So freedom was transgression. This became fashionable, perhaps to a certain extent is still with us. So to affirm life for them meant to break taboos, what they considered taboos, all this old stuff. So Gide's liberation in Morocco wasn't just personal, it was part of this broader cultural movement, this cultural moment where one found oneself in the act of throwing away or at least overturning inherited moral structures. Number 4, why the middle ground felt impossible to him. To a mystical Catholic like John of the Cross, John could integrate renunciation and ecstasy into one seamless vision. The cross leading to resurrection, death leading to life. But Gide, cut off from that tradition by his Protestant background, only had two poles available to him: Protestant renunciation or pagan ecstasy. He lacked a sacramental imagination that could unite eros with agape. So the middle path was invisible to him. And his family had of all come from a Catholic family, so near and yet so far. In other words, Gide found the answer at the opposite extreme because his imagination was shaped by always binary categories: repression versus freedom, purity versus pleasure, the idea that there could be a fertile asceticism where renunciation gives life, as is the case with St. John of the Cross, never really entered his framework. I find that I haven't read all his books, but I found that even out of curiosity, when dealing with these problems of love, that he wouldn't go to St. John of the Cross. Everybody knows that he was a very learned gentleman, surely. I don't know whether he did or he didn't, but it seems almost, why wouldn't he even consider looking at Catholic writers? I don't quite know, but as I said, I haven't read all his works. Some journal passages, so that you can hear Gide himself wrestling between these two poles. He's describing the two gods pulling at him. Here are a few striking passages from Gide's journal where you can really hear him wrestling between this, as I said, these two gods inside of him. These two gods after Morocco, 1893. And I'm quoting him here. There are two gods in me. The God of my childhood. This is him speaking. There are two gods in me. The God of my childhood, the severe God of the Protestants, jealous, exacting, jealous to the point of pettiness. And then the other, the God of the sun, of youth, and of joy. End of quote. This is Gide laying it bare. He doesn't synthesize them. He just acknowledges that war inside of him. The second point, renunciation versus joy. This is from the early 1890s. I'm quoting him directly. Renunciation is not an end, it is a means. So he understands it. But I have made too much of it an idol. Here, he sounds like he is criticizing Alisas directly. Sacrifice for sacrifice's sake, he's saying in the book, is idolatry. Number 3, the discovery of desire in North Africa. He writes of this liberation of him through the desert, the sun, and the boys he encountered. He says, quote, "The sun has done more for me than the Bible. In its light, I saw that my scruples were killing me. I understood that joy also is divine." And this is his conversion moment. It's almost like St. Augustine's under the fig tree, if you remember, but inverted. St. Augustine's conversion under the fig tree was a pivotal moment in the late summer of the year 386 in Milan, where he fell to the ground weeping, and he seemed to hear a child's voice singing Tolle lege, take it and read, and then opened the book, and it landed on Paul's epistles, reading a passage from the Romans that dispelled his doubts and led to his wholeheartedly embracing Christianity from that point on, that pivotal moment. This event is recounted in his confessions, and it seems to be the apex or the culmination of his intense spiritual struggle. And number 4, the need for excess. Gide says, quote, "I cannot content myself with moderate wisdom. I need excess, either in abstinence or in pleasure." Those are his words. That explains why he swings to extremes. Balance felt lifeless to him. Number 5, the pagan mysticism. Later in life, he will reflect, he says, "I believe in a pagan mysticism in which the movement towards God does not pass through renunciation, but through the affirmation of life." We're going to see when I go more into St. John of the Cross how he may be misunderstanding affirmation too. This could almost be Nietzsche, but spoken in the language of someone who still feels the shadow of Protestantism at his back. So in his journals, Gide is constantly oscillating between one and the other. First the god of severity, then the god of the sun. He never quite unites them, but he is lucid enough to actually name the split. Now, how this unresolved tension plays out across his novels. For example, in Straight is the Gate, you can see that rigorism, the immoralist, perhaps liberation. The Counterfeiters is a kind of a search for balance. It's almost like reading his work in sequences, is watching him negotiate the fight between his two gods. So, a summary before the debate. A summary, André Gide's understanding of love. Let's set up this carefully. Okay, so André Gide, 1869 to 1951, tends to see love in terms of desire, authenticity, self-realization, and liberation from conventional morality. He often emphasizes the reckless, instinctive part of him, sometimes even the destructive aspect of love. Love as a force, as he sees it, that resists possession, institutions, or dogma. That is how love has to be. A force that resists possession, which he sees as domination, institutions of any kind, dogma. Okay, now that is his view of life. St. John of the Cross, 1542 to 1591, on the other hand, frames love in mystical theocentric terms. Love for him is a consuming fire that purifies. Don't worry, they're going to debate, right? So this is all going to be very clear in a moment, but just let me give you the... Love for him is a consuming fire that purifies, annihilates the self, and unites the soul with God. We're going to see how. We're going to see how, because in the debate, we are going to change what we are going to do is not, as I said at the beginning, is not to debate the beloved, okay? One love divine and the other earthly and mundane. Yeah, no. But how to love. So St. John of the Cross, I thought, would have no problem by not saying God, but using in familiar terms so that the audience can understand the word beloved. And perhaps even instead of saying the soul, he's going to use the heart so that we can understand all this better, okay? But his language is deeply paradoxical. That is why we have to be careful how in the St. John of the Cross I'm talking about. Loss as gain, darkness as light, annihilation as fullness. Here are some passages that show the sharpest contrasts. André Gide and John in The Immoralist, 1902. In that book, Michel reflects, "It is better to be hated for what one is than to be loved for what one is not." I agree with that. Everyone does. It is better to be hated for, well, I don't know. It is better to be hated for what one is than to be loved for what one is not. I think all of us will say, yeah, I agree, but then in practice, we do. In The Fruits of the Earth, in 1897, Gide exhorts, "Know that you can never possess anything, not even love. Love must be renewed, created anew, continually." So here love is changeable, restless, bound to freedom, bound to freedom. For Gide, clinging or seeking permanence distorts love. He feels jailed. Possession is the enemy because he thinks it's domination. St. John of the Cross on love, "O soul most beautiful of all creatures, so anxious to know the dwelling place of your beloved, so you may go in search of him and be united with him. Now I am telling you that you yourself are his dwelling, his secret chamber and hiding place." And in the spiritual canticle, "The soul has now reached the perfect union always, perfect union of love with God. It is not only transformed into God, but God communicates to it his own being. Here, love is not restless freedom, but consuming union. Love culminates in annihilation of self, not its assertion of self, not the assertion of self. Possession is not rejected, but transformed. God possesses the soul. Let's say the beloved. The beloved possesses the soul entirely, and the soul delights in being possessed, in that possession by the beloved. The key contrast in Gide, love is perpetual movement, never final, always threatened by possession or being possessed or convention. The individual is the most important part. The individual is central, and love serves the discovery of oneself. That is its mission. In St. John of the Cross, love is an ultimate consummation, where the self is lost in the beloved. The individual is effaced. Love goes towards union, not self-expression of the parts. So here's my imagined dialogue between André Gide and St. John of the Cross. A dialogue about love. I've worked on this all day. All right, so it's going to take several different ways. Okay, so first, Gide, love cannot be grasped or possessed. The moment you attempt to hold it fast, it ceases to live. True love is freedom. It renews itself continually. To confine it within convention or permanence is to betray its essence. St. John of the Cross, my dear André, you speak of freedom, but freedom without an end is restlessness. Love reaches its fulfillment when it consumes the self entirely and unites it with God. To possess and be possessed in God is not a betrayal. Let's say what I promised you, I think I didn't put it in this part, that instead of God, we say the beloved, yeah? Because what we are discussing. So, love reaches its fulfillment when it consumes the self entirely and unites with the beloved. To possess and be possessed in the beloved is not a betrayal. To be possessed by the beloved is not a betrayal, but the highest perfection. Gide, I disagree, Your Eminence. Oh, you're a priest. Okay, so how do you have Father, right? Okay, Father, I disagree. I say that possession is precisely the danger. To wish to possess another, even God, to wish to possess another risks corrupting love into domination. Love, to remain pure, must affirm the other in their freedom. Distinct, yeah. St. John of the Cross. In divine love, possession is not domination. He could say in true love, possession is not domination. It is a mutual transformation. I'll explain this mutual transformation in a minute. Might give rise to misunderstandings. the soul is in God, or let's say the heart is in the beloved by participation, and the beloved dwells in the heart. There is no loss of freedom, for in the beloved, the heart discovers its truest liberty. Gide, I cannot accept annihilation of the self as the goal of love. Love ought to disclose one's individuality more fully, to bring to light what is most authentic in each of us. St. John of the Cross, but individuality, my dear André, individuality without transcendence remains incomplete. The self you seek to affirm is only fulfilled when it is emptied and surrendered. In losing itself in the beloved, the soul or the heart discovers not less, but more, an infinite love beyond desire's instability. Let me explain. And since I'm putting words into St. John of the Cross's mouth, which is quite a daring thing to do, I wanted to explain this because I think it has to be explained. And so I'm going to use another mystic, my lovely mystic, the one that I translated, when he speaks of this, and it's the same thing. And he explains it very well. So here it is. Love is of imagining the debate, John of the Cross is saying this. Love is of two types, singular and reciprocal. And this we need to remember in order to understand this philosophy better. So we say singular love when I love someone, but I am not loved in return. Singular. Reciprocal love, on the other hand, is when I love and I am loved in return. Got it? I love and I am loved back in return. Now, let's go into this deeper about dying and annihilating and affirmation and all this. In singular love, the lover dies in any case because dies figuratively, you understand. In singular love, when it is not returned, the lover dies. His love dies. Because the lover neither lives in himself nor in the beloved. You don't live in yourself because you're giving yourself to someone, so you die in yourself, but you're not living in the other, in the beloved, because he doesn't accept you. Because you are not loved in return. But when the beloved responds to the lover with love, the beloved at least lives in him. Amazing and ingenious is this give and take of love. That I, by loving you, and you, by loving me, you live in me and I live in you. We exchange lives and give ourselves one to the other. I do not have myself. When I love you, I do not have myself, and you do not have yourself. But you have me, and therefore yourself within me. And I, that I love you, I have you, and therefore myself within you. So my beloved is more myself, is closer to me than I am to myself, because in loving you, I die, figuratively, and if I live, it is because my beloved requites my love, and in so doing, gives me back life, gives me life, and I benefit and gain from it, and this life is more important now to me than myself. It is great, this virtue and efficacy of reciprocal love, because it brings the lover closer to the beloved than to himself. And because, although dead in himself, he is reborn in the beloved. And it is worth noting that although only one death occurs in reciprocal love, the rebirth is nevertheless twofold. One death, but two lives. The rebirth is twofold. How? In this way. Since in my loving you, you possess me, and in your loving me, I possess you. By loving and possessing each other, I give you life, and at the same time regain mine in you. O blissful death from which two lives are born! How blissful this intercourse by which I give myself to someone, and in return I gain not only myself back, but that someone as well. And having had but one life to begin with, through this death, simply by loving, I now have two lives. I hope that was a little clear. Don't know. In any case, all right. So, Gide then says, then our difference is clear. I defend love as an ever-renewed freedom of desire, inseparable from self-discovery. St. John of the Cross, and I uphold love as consuming union, where desire is purified into surrender, and the self passes into the other life, the eternal life with the beloved. Let me see if I can get some with quotations from them both. Gide, quotation from him. It is better to be hated for what one is than to be loved for what one is not. All right. Love. So this is where I'm taking it from. Love must reveal the true self, or it is no love at all. It must remain free, unbound by rules or attachments or permanence. Certainly marriage. St. John of the Cross. O soul most beautiful of all creatures, you yourself are his dwelling, his secret chamber and hiding place. He's saying true love is union, not assertion. In losing yourself to find the beloved, and in losing yourself, you find the beloved, and in the beloved, as I said, you find yourself back. Gide, but love must be renewed, created anew, continually. You should never possess it, not even in its most tender forms. In other words, clinging destroys it. Love thrives in movement, in the quest, not in the stillness of surrender. St. John of the Cross, the soul has now reached the perfect union of love with God, with the beloved. It is not only transformed by being within the beloved, but the beloved communicates to it his own being. In other words, surrendering love is not death. It is transformation. In giving oneself entirely, love achieves its ultimate fulfillment. Gide, to cling, this is the quote, to cling, to seek eternity in another is the death of love. Love is desire, not possession. Without freedom, love cannot breathe. St. John of the Cross. The dark night is the purification of the senses and the spirit by which the soul or the heart is detached from everything and the beloved is all in all. What does that mean? Love requires detachment, yes, but this detachment is not emptiness. It is the very fullness of union with the beloved. Gide, so we disagree. I defend love as restless, personal, always seeking revelation in the other. St. John of the Cross. And I defend love as consummate, divine, transforming the self into the beloved's own life. Desire is purified into surrender, and in that surrender, the heart attains its most profound freedom. Let me continue this debate in rounds, okay? One round is going to be the desire versus surrender, freedom versus union, just to understand it better. Eros versus agape, okay, where each one will perhaps even use their quotes. I don't know whether I put them here. Round one, freedom versus union. Freedom to do, okay, and union, consummate union. Gide, love must never compromise the self. Its freedom, its very vitality, lies in its refusal to be confined. St. John of the Cross. True love is found not in asserting the self, but in surrendering to the beloved. Freedom is perfected not in clinging, but in union. Gide, but love must be renewed, created anew, continually. You can never possess it, not even in its most tender forms. To bind it is to kill it. Love is always movement, never stillness. St. John of the Cross. Surrender does not kill love. It consummates it, transcendent restlessness into eternal fullness. Okay, that was round one. Round two, desire versus purification. Desire versus purification. Gide, his quote, to cling, to seek eternity in another is the death of love. Love is desire, not possession. That's what love is. Our passions illuminate, this is quote, illuminate our identity. They are the path to authenticity. St. John of the Cross, quote, the dark night is the purification of the senses and the spirit by which the soul, the heart, is detached from everything, and the beloved is all in all. In other words, it is desire that left to itself, it binds. It is desire that binds. Purified desire turns outwards, seeking the beloved alone, and transforms the heart. Yet desire is never still. It is always a process of discovery, of awakening the self through the other. John. In the night of the spirit, leave everything behind and rest in the beloved. Love is fulfilled when the heart's longing, all its restless seeking, is transformed into pure union. Discovery gives way to consummation. Round 3. Selfhood versus annihilation. Selfhood, annihilation. Gide. True love reveals the individual. Without it, there is only pretense. The self must remain central, even in the most intimate bonds. Love should illuminate individuality, not dissolve it. John. The heart that possesses the beloved finds that in losing itself, it possesses all. Only by letting go does the self reach its highest truth. Love is not the assertion or the assertiveness. I don't know what's the right word. Love is not the assertion of love, of I. Love is not the assertion of I, but the complete surrender of I into the beloved. To the beloved. That's what love is. Gide. Love is movement, and movement cannot be contained. To still it is to betray it. Even the highest love, if it demands stillness, is a prison. John of the Cross. Love is not found in clinging, but in being transformed and consumed by the beloved's fire. Stillness is not death. It is the transfiguration of love into eternity. I don't know that Gide is understanding this. Come to think of it. Round 4, synthesis or impasse. Gide. Then you and I are separated by our vision. I seek love that awakens, excites, and liberates the self. It is human, fragile, but radiant, precisely because it moves. John. And I seek love that perfects, transforms, and consumes the self in union. It is divine, it is infinite, and luminous precisely because it surrenders. Gide. Love for me must always be reborn. John. Love for me is perfected in eternity. I think I leave it there. This is the end of the debate. There is so much more to say, but that is kind of as far as I got. And I would appreciate your kindness in acknowledging the video and give me a like. St. John of the Cross wouldn't say, give me a like. Okay, so yeah, acknowledge it if you can in some way, and comments or share or whatever. I thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.